On February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern Railway freight train consisting of 3 locomotives and 149 mixed freight cars, some of which contained hazardous materials, departed Toledo, Ohio, en route to Conway Yard, Pennsylvania. The train weighed about 18,000 tons and was about 1.8 miles long. At approximately 8:54 p.m., as the train approached East Palestine Rail Yard, 38 rail cars derailed, including 11 tank cars carrying hazardous materials. 3 of these tank cars, carrying flammable and combustible hazardous materials, were mechanically breached during the derailment and released material that ignited, leading to a fire that would grow to include 35 rail cars. That initial incident and the subsequent deliberate vent and burn operation sent toxic materials into the air, soil, and creeks in the area. The incident caught the attention of the nation and caused lingering fears for residents of the town of East Palestine, Ohio, and for many in neighboring states. Concern about air quality and toxicity levels raised questions about railway regulations and government transparency that linger to this day. This presentation will review the events that happened in Ohio, and will finish with a discussion about how DEC as an agency would approach such an event if and when it happens in New York. First, let's start with a review of the timeline of events. Train 32N, as it's called, arrived at Terminal Railroad Association, TRRA, in Madison, Illinois on February 1st. At 8:30 p.m., qualified TRRA inspectors performed a brake test and mechanical inspection. The inspection did not result in any defect reports, and the train was approved for departure. The train departed the Madison TRRA yard with a Norfolk Southern crew at 10:14 p.m. on February 1st, eastbound, with a final destination of Conway Yard in Conway, Pennsylvania, with several planned stops along the way. Train 32N arrived at Norfolk Southern Rail Yard in Decatur, Illinois at 6:10 a.m. on February 2nd. 12:31 p.m., 55 rail cars were removed and 40 rail cars were added. Qualified Norfolk Southern inspectors conducted a brake test and mechanical inspection on the 40 new rail cars and found no defects. Train 32N departed the Decatur Rail Yard at 4:15 p.m. on February 2nd and arrived in Toledo, Ohio at about 1 p.m. on February 3rd. The 3-person accident crew, as we'll call them, consisting of an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee, went on duty at 1:15 p.m. The accident crew conducted a briefing with the previous crew and tested the train's brakes. The train departed Toledo, Ohio at 2:15 p.m., beginning the last leg of its trip before its derailment. During this leg, Train 32N encountered 3 hot bearing detectors, or HBDs, as indicated on the screen. It fully traversed the first 2 HBDs and derailed while passing over the third. At 7:37 p.m., Train 32N passed over an HBD at milepost 79.8 in Sebring, Ohio. The HBD reported a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient temperature on the right side bearing of the 101st wheel set to pass the detector. The bearing temperatures did not result in any alarm. At 8:13 p.m., Train 32N passed over the HBD in Salem, Ohio, milepost 69.01. The HBD recorded a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient on the L1 bearing of the hopper car, a temperature exceeding Norfolk Southern's 90 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient threshold for a non-critical alert. The HBD transmitted a non-critical alert to the Advanced Train Control ATC desk about the temperature of the L1 bearing, but as designed, did not broadcast an alarm to the train's crew. Around the same time, 8:13 p.m., Train 32N passed 4 surveillance cameras in Salem, Ohio that recorded images of the train. The images showed a fire on wheel set number 1 of the hopper car over wheel bearing L1, as seen in the surveillance footage on your screen. About 8:52 p.m. on February 3, 2023, train 32N began to traverse a hot bearing detector at milepost 49.81 in East Palestine, Ohio. Locomotive event recorder data showed the train was traveling at about 43 miles per hour. The maximum authorized speed in the area was 50 miles per hour. Less than a minute later, this HBD recorded a temperature of 253 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient on the L1 bearing of the hopper car. The HBD immediately transmitted a critical alarm. The alarm was received by the lead locomotive radio and broadcast over the in-cab speakers that read, quote, "Critical alarm, critical alarm, critical alarm. Norfolk Southern milepost 49.8, track 1 hot box, axle 101 south rail," end quote. Under Norfolk Southern operating rules, a critical alarm requires a train's crew to immediately stop the train and inspect the wheel set that triggered the alarm. According to event recorder data, the engineer began to slow the train using dynamic braking as required. The head-end locomotives then traveled about 1,160 feet before coming to a stop 38 seconds later. The crew radioed Norfolk Southern dispatch that it had experienced an emergency. The Norfolk Southern Cleveland East dispatcher confirmed the emergency at 8:56 p.m. and began coordinating train movements in the area to prevent other trains from colliding with the now stopped train 32N. But, unbeknownst to the crew, the damage had already been done. Here's a quick overview of the map showing the events. First, the hot bearing detector at milepost 49.81, showing the direction of travel down the tracks, and the section of tracks highlighted indicating the extent of the derailed equipment and the early fire that ignited. It also shows the location of the initial command post that would later be moved. Here's a quick look at the summary of events. 8:52 p.m. The train begins to traverse the hot bearing detector. 8:53, the hot bearing detector broadcasts a critical alarm. Also at 8:53, the crew begins to slow the train with dynamic braking. 8:54, the train experiences an uncommanded emergency braking application. At 8:56, Norfolk Southern Cleveland East dispatcher confirms that the train had experienced an emergency. Also at 8:56, the first 911 calls begin coming in to East Palestine Fire Department. At 9 p.m., the East Palestine Fire Department personnel reach the derailment scene, and the deputy fire chief establishes the first command post near the derailment. At 9:04, East Palestine Dispatch requests consist information from Norfolk Southern about the contents of the train. Then at 9:53 p.m., residents within 1 mile are advised through the WENS wireless emergency notification system to shelter in place. At 10 p.m., Norfolk Southern emails the consist to CCEMA, Columbia County Emergency Management Agency, Director. At 11 p.m., residents within 1 mile are ordered through WENS to evacuate. Also at 11 p.m., Norfolk Southern Hazardous Materials personnel reach the scene, followed by their contractors. Now into February 4th, at 12 a.m., the command post was relocated to a further safer distance to the fire and police station over a mile away. And then at 2 a.m., the East Palestine Fire Department fire chief arrived on scene and assumed the incident commander role. Now let's take a look at some of the photos of the early train derailment and the subsequent fire. This photo, taken by an East Palestine resident shortly after the train derailment, shows just how close it was to some of the houses in the neighborhood. Another photo taken by a resident in the East Palestine neighborhoods that surrounded the derailment. Photo taken by an Ohio resident capturing footage from the large fire that erupted. Overhead view of the derailment and early fire taken by drone. Another closer photo of the initial fire, also taken by drone. This photo, taken the next morning, Saturday, February 4th, shows the fire continuing to burn. Here is another drone photo of the fire, also on Saturday, February 4th. And here's one more drone photo of the derailment from a distance and the fire that continues to burn. Most of what happened up to this point, chaotic though it was, is not really very controversial, and was for the most part unavoidable. The decision, however, to vent and burn was not. The derailed equipment included 5 mechanically intact tank cars carrying vinyl chloride monomer, VCM, and 1 mechanically intact tank car carrying isobutylene, hazardous materials. Norfolk Southern and SPSI, Specialized Professional Services, Inc., their contractor, had been considering 2 methods of unloading the VCM from the tank cars, hot tapping and flaring, having already rejected a third, product transfer, because 3 of the VCM tank cars had damaged fittings. Here's a summary of each method. First, product transfer, transferring lading from the unloading valves and fittings of each damaged tank into a receiving tank. Flaring, a controlled release of lading through a flare pipe, a device designed to gradually burn off flammable materials at a safe location, attached to a top fitting. Hot tap, that's where welding a threaded nozzle into the tank and drilling through the tank wall to allow flaring or transfer, even if the original unloading valves and fittings were damaged. According to the contracted SPSI president, the top fittings of 3 VCM tank cars appeared damaged, which meant removing the product without cutting through the tanks would be impossible, so option 1 was out. He also said that cutting into the tanks for either flaring or hot tapping would be dangerous because they might have partially emptied, meaning that the flame or the cutting torch would impinge on the vapor space, the space of the tank filled with vapor rather than liquid lading, and could result in a fire or explosion. The SPSI president said that because of these concerns about polymerization affecting pressure relief devices, PRDs, and the dangers of alternative methods of unloading, both SPSI and Norfolk Southern were, quote, already there at vent and burn in our minds, meaning they'd already made a decision. When it comes to vent and burn, the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, characterizes a vent and burn as a last resort method of unloading a damaged tank car, to be used only, quote, when all other emergency product removal methods have been considered and rejected, end quote. In a vent and burn, a tank car is punctured with explosives at the highest point in the tank to reduce the pressure in the tank car, then punctured with explosives at the lowest point in the tank to release lading. The released lading is directed through a trench and burned in a prepared pit. Computer modeling had shown that if the VCM tankers got hot enough to experience BLEVE, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, BLEV, and the pressure relief devices were not allowing pressure to be released, the resulting uncontrolled explosion could result in tank car debris being propelled up to a half-mile. The shipper of all 5 VCM tank cars was Oxyvinyls LP, which had also manufactured the VCM. At 2 p.m. on February 5th, 3 representatives from Oxyvinyls arrived on scene to provide technical assistance regarding the characteristics of VCM. SPSI and Norfolk Southern representatives had already concluded that the pressure relief devices, PRDs, on the VCM tankers were not functioning due to polymerization, and that any other method of offloading would be too risky, so a vent and burn was the only option. Oxyvinyl representatives did not agree that the pressure relief devices, PRDs, were blocked or that polymerization had occurred, but they were not included in the decision to vent and burn. Shortly after the Incident Command meeting on February 6th that did not include Oxyvinyl representatives, where the Norfolk Southern and SPSI representatives outlined their intent to perform a vent and burn, the incident commander focused on ensuring that appropriate residential evacuations were underway in preparing for a possible vent and burn. Once the Ohio and Pennsylvania governors were satisfied that evacuations were completed, a Norfolk Southern representative asked the incident commander and the Ohio governor to meet in a separate room with Norfolk Southern, SPSI, and SRS Specialized Response Solutions personnel, including the Chief Executive Officer of Norfolk Southern. When interviewed by NTSB after the accident, the incident commander reported that the SPSI president and SRS project manager said in this meeting that he, the incident commander, had 13 minutes to decide whether to allow them to proceed with the vent and burn because they wanted to begin before 3 p.m. to avoid the effects of an atmospheric temperature inversion that would trap the toxic gases, and thus by avoiding that would allow the vapor cloud to disperse. The incident commander said that he felt overwhelmed and blindsided by the size of the decision and the significant time constraints. Before agreeing to proceed, the incident commander asked SPSI and SRS contractors to explain the vent and burn process and to repeat why it was necessary. The SPSI president and SRS project manager told the incident commander that if a tank car's temperature rose to 150 degrees, for safety reasons, they would withdraw their personnel from the area and stop any attempt to prevent an uncontrolled explosive tank rupture. They also told the incident commander that if the temperature in the tank car reached between 153 and 158 degrees Fahrenheit, the result would be an uncontrolled polymerization reaction, accompanied by a rapid rise in temperature. By the time of the meeting on February 6th, the highest tank car temperatures had fallen from about 138 degrees Fahrenheit the previous afternoon to about 126 degrees Fahrenheit. But despite that drop, SPSI, SRS, and Norfolk Southern decided to proceed with the vent and burn, and the incident commander reluctantly agreed. The vent and burn was originally scheduled for 1 p.m. on February 6th, 2 hours ahead of the 3 p.m. deadline described to the incident commander. However, the vent and burn was repeatedly delayed for technical and safety reasons, once to rewire the charges, and 3 times because unauthorized persons entered the evacuation zone. ESI, Explosive Service International, detonated the vent and burn charges at 4:37 p.m. for all 5 VCM tank cars, puncturing each tank car at 2 points, the highest point in the vapor space and the lowest point where the liquid had pooled. The punctured tank cars expelled vapor which was ignited by flares positioned near each tank car. Burning VCM resulted in a column of black smoke that grew into a persistent cloud. This image is of the vent and burn 3 minutes after detonation. Here's another view of the vent and burn operation in the column of toxic smoke, as viewed from a distance behind the school. And another view of the vent and burn from a neighborhood outside the evacuation zone. Looking at this image, it's pretty easy to imagine why there would be concerns amongst the community. and drone footage of the vent and burn, which appears to show the clouds spreading out over the town. Here is a drone photo of the East Palestine train derailment smoldering after the fires diminished. And here's a photo of the remains of one of the burned rail cars, surrounded by contaminated soil and firefighting foam. To support unified command efforts to evaluate soils most likely impacted by smoke and soot from the February 6, 2023 vent and burn operation, EPA requested an event reconstruction model and map from the Interagency Modeling and Atmospheric Assessment Center, IMAC, that shows the smoke plume and resulting soot surface deposition. The map estimates the extent and concentration of soot deposited into the environment through the plume area, which is located within the areas of both Ohio and Pennsylvania. The map shows that the highest estimated concentration of soot is downwind from the derailment site, over a roughly 8-mile by 2-mile area in western Pennsylvania. However, according to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the air plume and chemicals from the vent and burn dissipated, and air quality monitors around the perimeter of the derailment site did not measure any harmful pollutant levels entering Pennsylvania as a result of the derailment or the controlled burn. According to the Pennsylvania DEP, there were no long-term air quality concerns related to the derailment. The vent and burn took several hours to subside during the late afternoon on February 6th. Norfolk Southern began wreckage clearing on February 7th, following assessment of the isobutylene tank car that had come to rest between the eastern group of VCM tank cars. The isobutylene tank car was successfully moved to an adjacent staging area on February 7th and transloaded. Norfolk Southern resumed rail service through East Palestine on Main Track 2, adjacent to the derailment site, on February 8th, and the first train passed through the derailment site at 4:46 p.m. Here's a look at what happened in the aftermath of the derailment. First, the mandatory evacuation order was lifted at 5:28 p.m. on February 8th, 5 days after the derailment and 2 days after the vent and burn. The incident commander lifted the evacuation order as a result of meetings with the governors of Ohio and Pennsylvania, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention after air and water samples taken the day before, on February 7th, were deemed safe. February 10th, the EPA reported in a letter to Norfolk Southern that vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, ethyl exyl acrylate, and ethylene glycol monobutyl ether were released during the incident and were detected in samples from several creeks near the derailment site. February 13th, in an open letter, Norfolk Southern Railway President and CEO Alan Shaw stated that the company was committing $1 million to a community support fund as a, quote, down payment on its contribution to rebuilding the village. Quote, "I hear you, we hear you," Shaw said. "My simple answer is that we are here and we will stay here for as long as it takes to ensure your safety and to help East Palestine recover and thrive," end quote. February 15th, residents confronted local, state, and federal officials during a town hall where many voiced health and safety concerns a week after the evacuation order was lifted and called for assurances that the testing will protect themselves and their loved ones before moving back to their homes. State and federal officials have maintained that the air, soil, and water surrounding the crash site remain safe, enough for residents to return, and that contaminated waterways were contained. February 17th, a plume filled with contaminants that floated over the Ohio River in the wake of the incident had, quote, completely dissipated, end quote, said Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. February 23rd, the Ohio EPA announced that the number of minnows killed in a 5-mile span of waterway originating from the derailment site is estimated to be more than 38,000. The number of other aquatic life killed as a result of the derailment, including small fish, crayfish, amphibians, and microinvertebrates, is estimated to be around 5,500, the agency said. March 3rd, crews began removing tracks and contaminated soil from the crash site. March 14th, Ohio filed a 58-count federal lawsuit against Norfolk Southern over the train derailment in East Palestine, alleging the railway operator violated various federal and state environmental laws and Ohio common law, quote, recklessly endangering, end quote, the health of residents and Ohio's natural resources. April 10th, Norfolk Southern agreed to a $600 million settlement to resolve a class action lawsuit related to the train derailment, followed by another settlement with the Environmental Protection Agency and Department of Justice valued at more than $310 million over the damage caused by the derailment, for a total approaching $1 billion in damages. June 16th, a new study found that the pollution from the wreckage and subsequent controlled burn of several of the train's cars spread over 16 states in the Midwest, Northeast, and Southern U.S., reaching 540,000 square miles, or 14% of the U.S. land area. Emergency responders from Ohio's EPA, Office of Emergency Response, ER, were deployed to East Palestine. ER team members took the lead role in field operations and incident oversight. This has been one of the longest ER deployments and most complex and challenging incidents in the history of Ohio EPA. In this photo, a resident displays a mannequin on their porch in East Palestine, Ohio, as cleanup from the February 3rd derailment continues. This was on February 24th. The sign reads, "We are not fine." A local resident collects a sample from Leslie Run Creek on February 25th, 2023, in East Palestine to test the pH and the total dissolved solids, TDS, of the water. Ohio EPA working to control runoff pollution. This map depicts the East Palestine groundwater flow and monitoring wells. The Ohio EPA Division of Drinking and Groundwaters, DDAGW, played an important role in monitoring and protecting the village's drinking water. DDAGW team members worked closely with the village, collecting samples at the village's water supply wells, drinking water plant, and sentinel monitoring wells located between the derailment site and the well field. Drinking water sampling results from the East Palestine municipal water system show no indication of contaminants associated with the derailment. The creek that flowed through town became heavily contaminated by the spill. Chemicals traveled 270 miles down the Ohio River. Contamination in the nearby Bull Creek and Little Beaver Creek is estimated to have killed close to 40,000 minnows. Equipment installed at various points along contaminated creeks to aerate the water ended up releasing chemicals back into the air. This graphic was part of an article entitled "Environmental and Private Property Contamination Following the Norfolk Southern Chemical Spill and Chemical Fires in Ohio," and was published in the Journal of Environmental Science, Water Research and Technology. And it demonstrates how homeowners and especially public workers continued to be contaminated through various processes. The authors conducted a rapid response, which included 6 field investigations and experiments to understand the chemical identity, fate, and exposure pathways after the evacuation order was lifted. Multiple buildings were chemically contaminated. The indoor air quality of a commercial building was found to be contaminated for 4.5 months after the derailment. Derailment chemicals were also found on building exteriors 5 weeks after the incident. Because the complexity, magnitude, and health threats posed to the community were not matched by the efforts employed by the responding organizations, the population experienced continued exposures for months. Workers as well as town visitors also experienced health symptoms. This study revealed unaddressed human exposure pathways. It also identified where crucial gaps requiring improved decision-making and technologies as well as recommendations to better protect human health and the environment before and during a response to chemical incidents. Following the derailment, Dr. Aaron Haynes, chair of the University of Kentucky's Department for Epidemiology and Environmental Health, surveyed approximately 400 adults in the East Palestine area about their health effects after the incident. Haynes found that 3 out of 4 residents suffered health impacts after the derailment, and over half the residents reported their conditions continued through the fall of 2023. Nose and eye irritation, coughing and wheezing, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, rashes, and feeling weak and tired were among the symptoms reported, according to Haynes. Numerous lines of evidence documented in the Ohio and Pennsylvania public health surveys confirmed that exposures occurred even after the evacuation order was lifted. Symptoms included impacts to the nose, throat, nervous system, lungs, and eyes among workers and the public. No question that between government agencies, railroad officials, contract specialists, and the general public, there is conflicting information and competing interests, which is a perfect environment for misinformation. That's where social media comes in. I'm going to show you a few posts from February 17th. So that's a full 14 days after the derailment and 11 days after the vent and burn. These are screenshots I took on my phone. This post, by a man calling himself Michael Rosenthal, was shared over 5,300 times in just 5 hours. And there were many other posts like it using the same photo. It read, quote, "Didn't want to believe there was a major hazmat issue. I wanted to believe it wasn't real. This is scary. Do not touch your vehicles without gloves. Vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, ethyl exyl acrylate, isobutylene, and ethylene glycol monobutyl ether are only some that are being reported that spilled. It's all the way in Connecticut now. Still think people are conspiracy theorists now? Watch your well water that you use to drink and shower with. This is very real. This also goes into the same reservoirs where you get your tap water from the sink." In response, Taylor commented, "That's crazy. When I lived in Maine, everyone had well water, and a lot of people were getting cancer, and they linked it to the water because it had a lot of granite, etc. in it. So I can only imagine all of these pollutants." Lauren commented, "Seeing it in West Hartford too on our cars, and the air smells chemical-like. News stations need to be tagged on here, question mark, question mark, question mark." Alex commented, "I told a handful of people yesterday not to let the rain touch them and to put their clothes directly in the washer once they get home. They thought I was nuts. Conspiracy theory groups are saying it's worse than Chernobyl but is being covered up." And in response to that, Krista responded, "You're not nuts. It's the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history." Sarah commented, "I've been stressing about this all week." Ashley commented, "It was only a matter of time until that shot got here, just a lot quicker than I thought." And Jenny commented, "My throat has been on fire and my tongue since Tuesday," etc., etc. And just to make sure his viral post continued to go viral, Mike commented on his own post, "Keep sharing. I want people to be aware of what the heck is going on. We used to give a shit about one another. We need to start to do it again." Now, it is impossible to know just by reading this whether Michael Rosenthal is a well-intentioned, albeit misguided and misinformed individual, or whether he was a Russian asset intentionally spreading fear and mistrust in the government. But it has been confirmed that Russian trolls were involved in spreading misinformation and disinformation during this time period. Now, it's worth noting it was not all misinformation. Meteorologist Ryan Hanrahan, whose identity is confirmed by the blue check mark next to his name, shared the fact that, quote, "The dust/residue on cars this morning has a pretty logical explanation, and that's dust kicked up from a dust storm in the plains a few days ago," end quote, which was, of course, the real cause of the visible residue on people's cars. And he goes on to explain that chemicals would have dispersed long before this point, but his post was shared, as you'll note, 44 times compared to the previous post that was shared well over 5,000. Note, this was on February 17th, and around this same time there were reports coming out of New York of people reporting orange death snow being attributed to the chemicals from East Palestine. That was also related to the dust storm in the plains several days earlier and not to the fires from the derailment. So here's kind of a quick look at a summary of some of the facts involved, from the incident to the impacts, and finally some of the facts related to the cleanup and remediation. This ends the case study on the East Palestine train derailment. Thanks for taking time to watch this video.